The unexpected inheritance. Drake GIS adjusted his black, high-tech suit as he stood before the colossal glass doors of Stellar Legal Associates, his heart pounding in his chest. The suit's fabric, woven with microscopic fibers that enhanced durability and comfort, clung to his athletic frame, a symbol of the countless battles and adventures he'd survived. Despite his unshakable confidence, an unsettling feeling twisted his stomach. The morning sun reflected off the glass facade of the building, casting colorful, prismatic beams that danced across the street in a dazzling display. It was almost beautiful, but the beauty felt cold and distant, just like the reason he was here. 2 days ago, he'd received a cryptic message from an unknown number, directing him to this prestigious alien law firm. "Please come to Stellar Legal Associates," it read. "You are requested to attend a meeting regarding an urgent and important matter." The tone of the message had been formal, polite even, but something about it gnawed at him. What could it possibly mean? Why him? And why here, of all places? Why do I always get tangled in this stuff? Drake muttered under his breath, running a hand through his short, neatly trimmed brown hair. He hadn't done anything recently to draw attention to himself, nothing that would lead to an inheritance anyway. He'd never even heard of the man who had supposedly left him something. The whole thing didn't add up. The building loomed above him, its sleek surface reflecting the world around it as though it were part of the sky itself. A soft hum of distant traffic reached his ears, but it didn't quite soothe him. His pulse quickened as the elevator doors behind him slid open, breaking him from his anxious reverie. A tall, imposing figure stepped out. The Rian guard was clad in a black and silver uniform that gleamed like polished steel, his alien features sharp and angular. His blue skin shone with an ethereal glow, and his glowing eyes flickered as he locked onto Drake. "Mr. GIS, the guard said, his voice deep and resonant. "They're expecting you." Drake swallowed hard. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice steady despite the unease clawing at him. He stepped into the elevator, the soft hum of its engines filling the silence as it ascended smoothly. As he watched his reflection in the polished chrome walls, he couldn't help but analyze himself. He looked the part, an athletic build, striking stubble, and a gaze that conveyed the grit of someone who'd seen the worst the galaxy had to offer, and survived it. Yet, despite his seasoned appearance, this situation felt different. There was no danger, no clear enemy, but an overwhelming sense of foreboding that wrapped around him like a cloak. The elevator slowed as it approached the 42nd floor, and the doors opened with a soft hiss. Drake stepped into a plush waiting room. The walls were lined with holographic displays of alien cultures, ancient star maps, and dazzling digital artwork that seemed to shift in real time. The air smelled faintly of rich leather, mingled with an underlying metallic tang. The room was empty, save for a single figure standing by the large conference table. A tall Rayan male in an immaculate suit, his face inscrutable and his stance stiff, motioned for Drake to follow. "I'm Attorney Krell," the Rayan said, his voice carrying the weight of someone used to handling powerful clients. "Please, come with me." Drake followed him through the hallway, noting how the gleaming floors and soft lighting gave the space an almost otherworldly feel. As they reached the main office, Krell waved a hand to signal him inside. The moment Drake stepped into the room, the full scope of the situation hit him. The office was vast, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering an awe-inspiring view of Nuza, the sprawling alien city below. Outside, ships of various sizes glided through the skies, their forms sleek and imposing. But inside, the air was heavy with the tension of bureaucracy, the kind of tension that could make even the most seasoned adventurer feel small. Around a large oval table sat several other figures, all of them alien. Most were Ryans like Krell, their skin varying in shades of blue and teal, though a few Andorians were present as well. One of them, a woman with sharp features and pale lavender skin, looked up from a datapad as Drake entered, her eyes narrowing with curiosity. None of them greeted him, though. They simply waited, as if they were all accustomed to this kind of business. "Please, take a seat." Krell gestured toward the empty chair at the end of the table, his tone professional and cold. Drake hesitated for only a second before sitting. The tension in the room was palpable, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just walked into something far bigger than he could possibly understand. Without further explanation, Krell activated a holographic display in the center of the table. The image that appeared was of a heavily embellished man, his face stern, his gaze unwavering. "This is Merchant Lord Thaxpaw," Krell said, his voice smooth, "one of the wealthiest and most influential traders in the Outer Rim." Drake leaned forward, staring at the holographic image. The man before him was not someone he recognized. His face was lined with age and wisdom, but there was a certain coldness to him, as though he carried the weight of too many debts to ever show warmth. But then, a name crept into Drake's mind. Va was a name often whispered in the darker corners of the galaxy, known for ruthless trade deals and even more ruthless collection of debts. Still, why would someone like him leave anything to Drake? They'd never met. "Lord Va passed away last week," Krell continued, his voice even more solemn. "And you, Mr. GIS, are named in his will." Drake's heart skipped a beat. "What? That doesn't make sense. I don't even know the man." Krell's gaze didn't waver. "Apparently, Lord Va felt indebted to you in some way. He was specific about his debts, and you were one of the people he sought to repay." Drake's mind reeled. "But I've never done anything for this guy. I don't even know what he's talking about." Krell simply nodded and pressed a button on the console, triggering the side door to slide open. As it did, Drake felt a chill run down his spine. The figure that emerged was a woman, tall and impossibly beautiful. She walked into the room with the grace of a predator, her emerald skin glowing softly in the dim light. Her long black hair cascaded down her back like a waterfall of ink. And her eyes, those amber eyes, were the first thing Drake noticed. They were filled with a strange mixture of sorrow and strength, as if they held secrets that had been buried for far too long. "This," Krell announced, his voice almost reverent, "is Dyra, Lord Va's most prized possession, his personal slave. And now she is yours." Drake's jaw dropped. His mind couldn't process what he was hearing. He wasn't sure what shocked him more, the idea of inheriting a slave or the fact that this woman, this stunning creature, was now inextricably linked to him by a will that he never signed. Dyra's amber eyes met his briefly before dropping to the floor. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back. Drake's gaze lingered on her, though he felt an uncomfortable tightness in his chest. She wasn't just a piece of property. She was a person, a being with thoughts, feelings, and a past that he couldn't even begin to fathom. "This can't be real," Drake muttered, shaking his head. "There has to be a mistake." The room fell into an eerie silence. The others exchanged confused glances, clearly bewildered by his reaction. Krell, however, seemed unfazed. "Lord Va's will is clear. Dyra is your responsibility now. Her training, her value. It's all yours to do with as you see fit. She is more valuable than most starships. Do you understand?" But Drake wasn't listening. He turned to Dyra, his voice softening. "Do you want to be free?" Her eyes snapped up, meeting his for the first time with a flicker of something he hadn't expected. "Hope." "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible but full of a quiet desperation. "More than anything." The decision was made in that instant. Drake's heart pounded in his chest as he stood up, his voice now steady and full of conviction. "I don't care about your rules or your laws. I'm using my right as her owner to set her free." The next hour was a blur. Data pads were passed between them, biometric scans were completed, and the forms were signed, each document more ridiculous than the last. But Drake didn't care. He wouldn't leave until Dyra was free. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Krell handed Dyra a new certificate, one that declared her free. "You are a free citizen now," he said, his voice laced with a hint of disbelief. Drake didn't wait for any more formalities. He turned and walked toward the door, Dyra following close behind. She had no credits, no possessions, no future, but at least she had a chance now. And for the first time in a long while, Drake felt that maybe, just maybe, he had done something right. A new beginning. Drake GIS stepped into the bustling streets of Nusa, his mind still reeling from the surreal events that had just unfolded in the sterile, high-tech office of Stellar Legal Associates. The air outside was warm, filled with the sounds of distant hovercars and the hum of 1,000 different alien species going about their daily lives. The vibrant cityscape of Nusa stretched out in every direction, with towering spires, floating platforms, and glowing billboards that painted the sky with holographic advertisements. The world felt alive in a way that almost made Drake forget for a moment why he was standing there in the first place. But the reality of the situation came crashing back down when he turned to find Dyra following him closely. She walked just a step behind, her green skin shimmering slightly under the sunlight as her black hair flowed behind her like a veil of midnight. For all her beauty and grace, there was an undeniable tension in the air around her, a quiet sadness, as though the weight of her past still clung to her every step. Drake looked at her for a moment, studying the woman who had just been freed from a life of servitude. Her amber eyes were distant, almost lost, as though she didn't fully understand what had just happened. She had been granted freedom, but freedom without a purpose, without a plan. She was free from Lord Vao's ownership, but now she had nothing. "Dyra," Drake began gently, his voice softer than he expected. "Are you okay? I know this is a lot to take in." She didn't answer immediately, her gaze fixed on the ground as she walked silently beside him. Drake sighed and adjusted his suit, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had just made a decision that would forever change the course of both their lives, and he wasn't sure what he was supposed to do next. He didn't know her, and she didn't know him. They were strangers thrown together by fate, and neither of them had any clear idea of what the future would hold. They walked in silence for several minutes, the sounds of the city blending with the weight of their unspoken thoughts. Drake finally broke the silence. "You don't have to follow me, you know. You're free now. You can go anywhere you want, do whatever you want. The world is yours." Dyra's eyes flickered up at him for a moment, the barest trace of something, perhaps doubt, perhaps uncertainty, crossing her face, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she continued walking alongside him, her pace matching his, as if she was unsure of where to go, unsure of what to do next. The moment stretched on, a feeling of awkwardness settling between them. Drake felt like an imposter, a man who had done something good, but didn't know how to fix the aftermath. He had given Dyra her freedom, but that didn't change the fact that she was still a slave to the galaxy's systems, a product of a harsh world where freedom was only a concept if you had the means to back it up. "Listen," Drake said, trying to make himself sound reassuring, though his voice trembled slightly. "I'm not going to pretend I know what it's like. I've never lived your life, and I can't even begin to understand everything you've been through. But I'll tell you this. You don't have to be alone anymore. I'm not going to abandon you. You don't have to figure this out by yourself." Dyra's amber eyes flickered to him once again, and this time she spoke. "I don't know what to do. I don't have a home. I don't have any credits, any connections, nothing. I've only ever been trained to serve, to be useful. But I have no purpose now." Drake's heart ached at the raw honesty in her voice. She wasn't just a slave, a piece of property. She was a person who had been deprived of everything that gave her life meaning. Now she was left with nothing but the echo of freedom, and the uncertainty of what to do with it. "You have a purpose," Drake said firmly, though he was unsure how he could promise that. "You just need time to figure it out, and you can take all the time you need. There's no rush." He didn't know what else to say. He had hoped that his words would be enough to comfort her, but they felt hollow in his own ears. After all, he wasn't the one who had been bound in chains for years, stripped of every ounce of autonomy. He wasn't the one who had lived a life of subjugation, trapped in a world that viewed him as nothing more than an object to be bought and sold. They continued walking, passing through the crowded streets. The contrast between them, Drake's confident stride and Dyra's hesitant, almost nervous movements, was impossible to ignore. His mind churned, looking for some solution, some way to help her, but the reality was that there were no simple answers. He could offer her freedom, but that didn't mean he could offer her a future. As they walked deeper into the heart of the city, Drake took note of the bustling marketplaces and crowded plazas, the hum of life that surrounded them. People from every corner of the galaxy walked by, some human, some alien, all focused on their daily lives. But for Drake and Dyra, the city felt like an alien world. She had been confined to a single existence for so long, and now, even though she was free, the vastness of the universe seemed almost oppressive. "We'll find a place for you to stay," Drake said, his voice determined. "I know a few contacts in the city who might be able to help. You'll get settled, and if you need anything at all, just let me know." Dyra didn't respond, but her pace slowed slightly. It was clear that she didn't believe him, not because she doubted his intentions, but because she simply didn't believe that a person like her, someone who had been used and discarded, could find a place in a world that had never shown her any mercy. They finally reached a quiet street lined with tall, nondescript buildings, their facades weathered and unremarkable. Drake stopped in front of one of them, a small private residence that he had rented for himself during his more covert missions. It was a safe place, secluded and private, perfect for someone who needed a fresh start. "I'll stay here for the night," Drake said, unlocking the door and stepping inside. "Tomorrow, we'll start figuring things out. You're free, Dyra, and we'll take it from there." As she stepped into the small, dimly lit apartment, Dyra's gaze swept across the sparse furnishings. The place was functional, clean, but far from luxurious. It was a far cry from the opulent life she'd been used to in Lord Vau's service. But it was hers now, just as much as it was his. This was the first step toward the future that awaited her, uncertain though it was. Drake stood in the doorway, watching her carefully, unsure of what more he could offer. But as he looked at her, this woman who had once been someone's property, someone's tool, and saw the faintest flicker of hope in her eyes, he realized that this was not the end. It was only the beginning. And for the first time in a long time, Drake allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they both had a chance at a new life. Together. The struggle for identity. The quiet of the small apartment was unsettling. Dyra sat on the edge of a worn, low sofa, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for something. Some sense of belonging, some trace of familiarity. The soft hum of the city outside filtered through the walls, a reminder that life continued all around them, indifferent to the upheaval she had just endured. Yet inside, everything felt like it had stopped. For her, there was no home to return to, no place in the universe where she truly belonged. She was no longer the slave of Lord Vau, but that didn't mean she was free of the chains that had bound her for so long. Drake stood by the window, looking out at the sprawling metropolis below. The lights of Nuza flickered like stars in the distance, a galaxy in miniature, vast and unreachable. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind still trying to make sense of the overwhelming decision he had made. He had given her freedom, yes, but what came after that? What kind of future could he offer her? It wasn't like he had answers to these questions. Hell, he wasn't even sure if he had the right to ask them. What kind of man was he to offer any kind of help to someone so broken, someone so scared by the very fabric of the galaxy's power structure? He turned to look at her. Dyra's green skin almost glowed faintly in the dim light, her posture stiff and closed off as she sat on the edge of the couch. He had expected her to be relieved, maybe even overjoyed to have her freedom, but instead, there was only silence. The weight of her past was too much for her to simply leave behind. She didn't know how to be free. Not yet. And even though he'd done what he thought was right, he couldn't help but wonder if he had given her something she didn't know how to use. "Do you want to talk about it?" Drake asked, stepping closer but careful to respect the distance between them. His voice was tentative, unsure. It had been days since she had been granted her freedom, and they hadn't really talked about her life, her past, or the future that loomed before them. She didn't look up at him, but her lips trembled as she responded softly, her voice distant. I don't know who I am anymore." The admission hit Drake harder than he expected. He had known that Dyra's life had been one of servitude, that she had been owned by Lord Va and treated as little more than an object. But hearing her voice tremble with that kind of pain, that uncertainty, made the depth of her struggle clear in a way that no amount of words could express. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," Drake said, his voice more gentle than he had intended. "You're free, Dyra. You don't need to have all the answers today. You can take your time." She slowly turned her gaze to him, her amber eyes dark and haunted. For a moment, it felt like she was looking right through him, as if searching for something that was buried deep within herself. "I've never had a choice in anything," she said, her voice thick with sorrow. "I don't know what it means to be free. I don't know how to live outside of servitude." Drake's heart clenched. He didn't know how to comfort her. He had never been in her position, never had the kind of life she had lived, where every decision was made for him, every action controlled by someone else's will. But he did know one thing. He wasn't going to let her face this alone. "I know you've been through hell, Dyra," Drake said quietly, "and I don't expect you to just snap out of it. But we can figure this out together, okay? You don't have to know everything right away. We can take it one step at a time." Dyra's eyes flickered briefly with something, hope, perhaps, or skepticism. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. She stood up abruptly, her movements stiff, and walked over to the small window. She gazed out at the city below, her expression unreadable. Drake watched her closely, waiting, unsure of what she needed from him. "I've never seen a place like this before," Dyra said after a long silence, her voice quiet but full of awe. "Everything is so different. It's beautiful in a way I can't understand. But it also feels like I don't belong here, like I'm not supposed to be a part of it." Drake felt a pang of sympathy as he stepped up beside her, looking out at the same view she was taking in. Nusa was vibrant, alive, but it felt like a world they were both strangers in. She had never experienced this kind of freedom, this kind of world, and he had never known what it was like to lose everything and have to rebuild from scratch. "You will," he said, his voice steady. "You will belong. It might take time, but you will find your place here. And I'll help you with that. You just have to trust me." Dyra turned toward him, her face a mask of uncertainty. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed to get caught in her throat. Instead, she looked back out the window, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Drake didn't push her. He knew she wasn't ready to talk about it all yet. Over the next few days, Drake kept his word. He introduced her to his contacts in Nusa, those who had connections to everything from temporary accommodations to employment opportunities. But everything felt like a false start. Every option seemed fleeting, like a quick fix to a problem that was far more complex than either of them had anticipated. They needed a real solution, something that would give Dyra a sense of purpose, something that could help her rebuild the identity she had lost. Drake found a small job for her, something that would allow her to start integrating into society. She began working at a local cafe, a small but cozy place that catered to both humans and aliens. At first, Dyra was hesitant, unsure of how to navigate this strange new world. She was used to being ordered around, to being a tool used to fulfill someone else's desires. But as the days passed, something began to shift. The first time she served a customer on her own, she hesitated. But then, when the customer smiled and thanked her, something clicked. It was the smallest of victories, but it was a victory nonetheless. She wasn't being commanded anymore. She was contributing to something, even if it was just a small part of something larger. Drake continued to check in on her, making sure she was doing okay. He had hoped that the work would help her feel more like herself, but he knew there was still a long way to go. The scars of her past wouldn't disappear overnight, and she would need time. Time to learn who she was outside of the person who had been owned and traded. Time to figure out what she wanted from this new life. The days turned into weeks, and slowly things started to change. Daira became more confident in her interactions, more comfortable in her new environment. She began to develop a rhythm in the cafe, learning the names of regulars and even making small talk with the customers. But every time she glanced in the mirror, there was a part of her that still didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her past was always there, lurking just below the surface, ready to resurface at any moment. One evening, after her shift had ended, Daira sat at a small table near the back of the cafe, staring down at her hands. Her fingers traced the delicate scars that marked her skin, remnants of chains and cuffs, of a life she could barely remember. Drake sat across from her, watching her silently. "It's getting easier," she said quietly, almost to herself. "But it's still hard. Sometimes I feel like I'm just pretending to be free. Like I'm still trapped in my own mind." Drake didn't know how to respond. The truth was, he didn't have the answers for her. He had never been in her shoes, never known the kind of struggle she faced. But he did know that she was stronger than she realized, that she had come farther in these few weeks than anyone could have predicted. "You're not pretending," he said quietly. "You're learning who you really are. And that takes time. But you'll get there. You'll find your way." Daira looked up at him then, her amber eyes meeting his with a flicker of something, a glimmer of hope, perhaps. And for the first time she smiled. It wasn't much, just the faintest curve of her lips, but it was a start. And for Drake, that was all he needed to believe that, despite everything, they were both moving in the right direction.